Hey, how you doing, students? Today I'll be discussing very briefly on Chapter 6, Measurement of Constructs. So there's two questions that I want to talk about a little bit. One is the conceptualization challenge, and the second is about the levels of measurement. So with students, I want you to think about choosing an abstract construct relevant to your field. So for example, um, organizational trust or community trust, community engagement, procedural justice. These are abstract type of constructs, and they could relate to your field, or it could be considered something where you think about it as related to your capstone project or a research paper or something like that. Clearly try to explain and conceptualize this type of construct and explain whether or not it should be treated as multidimensional, unidimensional, and provide some kind of justification and explanation to your construct. So the levels of measurement, that's the second part of this question that I want to talk about. It's another question I want to discuss. Provide one example each of nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio scaled variables that might be used in research related to your degree, or mention like a research paper or a capstone topic, or possibly some other area of interest you may want to explore in the program, or maybe something you're going to be thinking about down the road. Some of you may be considering doing a PhD, for example. Explain why each example fits into this designated level of measurement. So some of this should sound familiar to students, especially if you've taken statistics or research methods in college. Nominal ordinal is a very common term that they use, and if students have to study these things. So let's talk about a conceptualization challenge. So again, you have to choose an abstract construct relevant to your field. Organizational trust, community engagement, procedural justice, community trust. These are all different types of abstract concepts and constructs that you have to think about, maybe in your profession. Clearly conceptualize this construct, think about it hard, and explain whether or not it should be treated as a unidimensional or multidimensional, and provide some kind of justification and explanation for your construct. So, conceptualization is the process of defining abstract ideas in very clear and precise terms so that they can be studied scientifically. Many concepts in social sciences, such as trust, leadership, or job satisfaction, it cannot be directly observed and has to be first clearly defined before they can be measured in research. So, according to Bhattacharya, the textbook, conceptualization helps researchers clarify what a construct means and determine the specific components that make up that concept. A relevant construct, for example, in public safety organizations, is organizational trust, which can be conceptualized as a level of confidence, for example, firefighters or police officers have in their leadership, fellow personnel, and department systems to act competently, fairly, and in the best interest for both employees and the public. A balancing act, if you may. For example, let's say organizational trust in the fire department should be treated as a multidimensional construct because it involves several related components rather than as just a single concept. One dimension is trust in the leadership, meaning that firefighters should believe command staff and supervisors make sound operational and administrative decisions, taking into consideration the best interest for everybody. Now, another dimension is interpersonal trust among crew members, which is very critical in emergency operations, where firefighters rely on each other's training and judgment in high-risk situations. A third dimension could be involving trust in organizational policies and procedures, such as safety protocols and training standards. Because of these elements represent different aspects of trust within an organization, they must be examined separately to fully understand how trust affects teamwork, safety, and performance in emergency response agencies. So this is all in the textbook. And another good example would be, for example, well, let me talk a little bit about this. Another abstract construct that you can think about. For example, I have some students sometimes who are in law enforcement or police officers, things like that. Procedural justice is a big deal in law enforcement. Procedural justice, can be considered using the author Dr. Bhattacharya's examples. It can be understood as a theoretical construct rather than something that can be directly observed. So, in other words, it's kind of like an idea that has to be clearly defined before it can be measured. So, for example, in a law enforcement setting, I would say that procedural justice, I would define it as the extent to which police officers use their authority in a very fair, respectful, neutral, and consistent manner during interactions with the public. That definition matters because citizens often judge police legitimacy not by just the outcomes, such as arrests or reductions in crime, but by the quality of the process used to reach those outcomes. For example, you may consider, as the student in the class, that procedural justice could be a multidimensional construct rather than a unidimensional one. But Achari then goes on to explain that some constructs are made up of several related dimensions, and I think procedural justice actually fits that model. So it includes whether or not people feel they were treated dignity, they were had a chance to speak, whether the officer appeared neutral, and whether the decision-making process seemed fair. Those dimensions are all connected, but they are not identical. And a person could, for example, believe that the officer was respectful. Let's say they spoke respectfully, but they still feel that the traffic stop was biased or prejudiced in some manner or potentially discriminatory for a variety of reasons that they could think about. In that same way, of course, someone may accept that final decision, but still believe the process was actually unfair because they were never given a chance to explain themselves. This is why treating procedural justice as only one type of unidimensional construct, this would oversimplify the entire construct, the narrative. It's important because public trust is often shaped by the way police officers handle encounters, not just by whether law enforcement action was legally justified. There are many situations where the same enforcement outcome produced very different public reactions, depending on how the officer communicated and exercised discretion. That is why procedural justice is so important to have an understanding of what police-citizen encounters. So let me talk about the levels of measurement. Now, you have to think about an example of a nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio scale variable that might be used in research related to any kind of capstone topic, a research paper, perhaps a final paper, or other area of interest that you might want to explore in our program. Now, you have to also explain why each example fits in the designated level of measurement. So, for example, let's talk about this now. Different measurement levels aid in capturing different kinds of data in studies on organizational change resistance. So, for example, there's a department type. Let's say in an organization, right? You have HR, you have finance, you have operations, you have other departments. These are nominal variables because these categories are merely labels with no type of inherent order. A level of resistance is low, moderate, and high could also be an ordinal variable because these categories can be ranked, but the differences between them are not equal. Now, if you consider a Likert scale, on a Likert scale of 1 to 5, which I'm sure many students have seen, when you go to a restaurant like McDonald's or some other fast food place, Taco Bell may be a good example too. They give you a little survey at the end. On a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the best, 1 being the worst, how do you feel about the food today? You can say the same thing with an ordinal measurement in that sense. So you could say, for example, there isn't really a true zero per se, but the Likert scales are uniformly spaced out so that this actually fits in the interval level. And then, of course, there's years and years of organizational tenure. It's an example of a ratio variable because it has a true zero and permits significant magnitude comparisons. Now, these examples also illustrate how every measurement level has a specific function in gathering and evaluating organizational research data. Another example could be, let's say, a nominal type of disciplinary action in schools for education equity, for example. School funding disparities from urban to suburban or different areas. For example, in Houston, we have River Oaks, which is a very wealthy area. Maybe the third ward is not as wealthy. So the levels of education equity and funding is maybe not there because it's based on property taxes, of course, right? So you could look at also disciplinary actions as a nominal variable. And they could be in-school suspensions, they could be out-of-school suspensions, expulsions, and arrests by law enforcement officers. As you guys may know, of course, even schools have their own law enforcement departments. We have the militarization of policing in the United States, where there's everywhere you go, there's policing. You go to the public park, there's a police officer. City park, I don't know what the point of that is. Schools also have a lot of law enforcement officers. It used to be in my day, there wasn't anything like this. But it seems as though everybody seems more afraid. And it seems like a cycle in some ways, right? Because the more police officers you put out, the more fear it engenders, which means you have to have more officers to control more fear. And so the cycle keeps going. Just my opinion. This topic fits the nominal variable because it provides a different type of disciplinary action commonly seen in school systems. They all have different outcomes. So you can look at the data by filtering it by comparing groups and determining how many students fall in each category. Another one could be an ordinal variable, looking at this example. School resource level funding. So for example, you could rank and look at school resource levels into different categories, such as, for example, severely under-resourced, adequately resourced, well-resourced, top of the line resource, whatever kind of scaling you want to put in. But this variable is also considered ordinal because it has a well-defined ranking order. But the distance between levels is not specified. Now, there's also standardized test scores. You could look at standardized test scores as an interval variable because the difference between scores in underfunded and well-funded schools can be measured directly. This will allow many differences in how each school performs academically and behaviorally because, of course, there is a correlation between better behavior and test scores in schools that have been provided more resources and funding compared to their counterparts who don't have access to as many resources. Now, last part I want to talk about is ratio scaled variables, which could be considered as expenditures per student in dollars. The ratio scaled variables that you could explore are expenditures per student measured in dollars. So for example, in layman's terms, if you were to look at just like a guy in the street terms, that is the amount of money a school district spends per student each year. An example could be comparing the difference in a school district that spends $6,000 per annually versus one that spends $14,000 annually per student, which I think a lot of students probably know this. Just because you spend more money on a school per student, it doesn't mean you have better outcomes or better outputs. It's very difficult to measure that. And we've tried for perhaps maybe 100 years now for measurement, but it's very, very difficult to measure that. And the more money you throw at a problem, oftentimes it doesn't mean the problem really goes away. I mean, there's many examples in history you can look at that it doesn't seem to actually work. But this variable fits well because it incorporates elements of an interval variable, but it does have a true 0 point. This means that, of course, if you are a district that spends $0 per student annually, that means that district has no funding at all. There's no money at all. This variable will then allow you, for example, if you're doing research, to look at funding disparities and compare them with previously mentioned outcomes, with assuming your baseline is a 0. And you can look at other ones, the previously mentioned outcomes, as I mentioned before, like disciplinary action, suspension rates, graduation rates, in both the underfunded and the well-funded school districts, assuming you put together another Likert scale on a scale of 1 to 5. So I hope that this is a good way to have a better understanding of levels of measurement and about the conceptualization challenge in Chapter 6. And I appreciate you taking the time today to listen to me blather away. And I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Thank you.